Well, as we draw ever closer to the 20th century in our history of Christian missions, there are a number of changes that you will begin to notice. The first is that with the invention of photography, we will begin to view photographs of individuals and not just drawings or paintings of them. I have to say, I personally wish there'd been some photographs of William Carey, but the first ever known photograph of a human being was taken in 1838, 4 years after William Carey's death. The second thing, I wonder if you have noticed in our studies, is that the pioneer leadership we've been looking at has almost always been the exclusive domain of men. While women have played a part, it's usually been in a subsidiary role as a wife or a single woman who has remained somewhat in the background or in the shadows. Well, things began to change at the beginning of the 19th century, but it met with some significant opposition. In some cases, if a single man left for the mission field, of course, unmarried, the mission undertook the grave responsibility of sending out a partner for him. So this meant that the new potential wife was, by definition, a missionary's wife, which is very different from being a missionary wife. A missionary's wife has really the role of supporting and encouraging her husband, but a missionary wife has her own specific calling and will actively participate in the work of mission. Today, the call of the wife is seen as being as crucial and necessary, really, as the call of the husband, if she and her husband are to be sent to the field. And research has shown that one of the main reasons that families or couples never progress beyond a single term of cross-cultural service is often because the wife feels she has no role or no ministry. The former attitude of some hasn't really helped. I've dug up this comment from years ago from a certain Anglican bishop in Asia who said this, quote, "Young single women arriving on the mission field were bound to be married off in a year and would be the source of endless troubles." However, by the end of the 19th century, women in missions greatly outnumbered men. And from my experience, I would hazard a guess that that situation still applies today. Those days, you had to have a strong-minded and determined lady if she is going to enter and succeed in the overwhelmingly male-dominated world of missions. And in a day when exploration and pioneer work were not even considered an option for women, one woman not only bucked the trend, but she also broke the mold more than any others, and has ever since acted as an inspiration to countless others to follow where she led. Her name? Mary Slessor. And her story has not only been told, but unfortunately, sometimes it's been romanticized almost beyond recognition. As Ruth Tucker described in her book From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya, quote, "The image of Mary Slessor as a Victorian lady dressed in high-necked, ankle-length flowing dresses, pompously escorted through the African rainforests in a canoe by painted tribal warriors, is about as far removed from the reality as possible of the barefooted, scantily clad, red-headed, working class Scottish lady who lived African style in a mud hovel, her face at times covered with boils and often without her false teeth. So that should just about disabuse any of us from the beginning of any glamorous illusions we might have about pioneer mission work in Africa. So let's now meet the real Mary Slessor and see what we can learn from her. When the famous Scottish explorer and missionary, Dr. David Livingstone, spent 6 months in the mid-19th century walking across Africa from coast to coast, and he then walked back to his original coast, he not only opened up the dark continent physically, but also spiritually, in the sense that many believers reading of what he'd done began to show an interest and increasingly have a burden to reach the teeming, unreached masses with the gospel. One such person was Mary Slessor, although to human eyes, she must have seemed a most unlikely candidate given her background. Mary Mitchell Slessor was born the second of 7 children in Aberdeen, Scotland on December the 2nd in 1848. Now that's the same year that Marx and Engels published their Communist Manifesto. Mary's family was marked by poverty and frequent strife, mainly due to the sporadic work habits of her alcoholic father, who unexpectedly, like William Carey, was also a shoemaker, although any similarities end there. He would sometimes come home in a drunken rage and throw her out onto the streets, where she would be forced to spend the night alone. In 1859, the family moved from Aberdeen to Dundee, also in Scotland, for work, but ended up living in the slums. Well, with very little money being available, her education was seriously affected. So to supplement the meagre family income, most of which her father was drinking away, Mary started working part-time, aged 11, in the textile mills, alongside her mother, who was a skilled weaver, while trying at the same time to continue part-time with her own schooling. By the age of 14, she'd become a skilled jute worker and was by then working from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, with just an hour for breakfast and lunch. These extended hours were because, in part, her mother was pregnant again, subsequently delivering her 7th and final baby. Mary's father and both brothers died of pneumonia, leaving behind only Mary, her mother, and her 2 sisters. And over the next 13 years, she became the primary wage earner for the whole family. She later described herself as a, quote, wild lassie who spent most of her life either at work or at home or in the mills. There was little time or opportunity for leisure in that crowded, poor and polluted neighborhood in which she lived. However, her mother was a devout Presbyterian, and so church activities were a welcome outlet on the only day off, Sunday, and a welcome outlet from her miserable home life. And she was converted. She was converted through the ministry of a local elderly widow who would invite all the children into her house, where she would tell them about Jesus. And Mary became active in the local Presbyterian church. And after her father's death, she volunteered for home missions work, where she taught Sunday school. In her early 20s, she worked with Queen Street Mission, where she learned a lot that would prove very profitable in her future missionary life. For instance, she learned in the open-air services that were held in some of the most deprived areas of the city, how to stand up to foul-mouthed thugs threatening to beat her up, plus rude and filthy-minded street gangs who tried to break up the meetings. It was a baptism of fire. The courage she developed there in the blighted and impoverished neighbourhoods of Dundee would serve her well in later years. Her mother used to read each month the monthly record. This was the missionary record, which was a monthly magazine published by the United Presbyterian Church, which informed members of missionary activities and their needs. As a result, Mary became interested in foreign missions from an early age. Missionary meetings were common in her church, when missionaries on furlough would visit the church and make a plea for more workers. However, it was the death of David Livingstone when she was 27 years old that was the event that clinched her decision and caused her to take the momentous step to follow in his footsteps and become a missionary to Africa. The Calabar mission had been established 2 years before her birth, and she had always followed its progress with real and lively interest. Mary's mother had hoped her only living son, John, might become part of the overseas missionary force, but sadly he died when Mary was 25 years old. His death was a severe blow and shattered his mother's dreams. But for Mary, it was an inducement to, in part, escape the mills and take her brother's place. One positive sign was that this was right, was that the Calabar mission had always made room for women. All that was needed was for Mary to sever her close physical family ties. Easier said than done. In 1875, she applied to and was accepted by the Calabar mission, and after training in Edinburgh, she set sail in the summer of 1876, aged 27, in the SS Ethiopia, arriving in Calabar just over a month later. Well, you may be wondering where Calabar is. Calabar is located in present-day Nigeria and was well known, even infamous, for its slave trade and deadly environment. Her earliest years were spent at Duketown in the land of the Efik people, where she taught in a mission school and visited the Africans. She was warned that they believed in traditional West African religion and had superstitions in relation to women giving birth to twins. She quickly picked up the language and stayed there for 3 years. But as a mill girl from an impoverished background, she struggled. She struggled because she was dissatisfied with the comfortable missionary station and never really felt quite at ease with the social niceties and what to her was the affluent lifestyle of the several missionary families who were comfortably stationed there. About this, they too had some reservations about this rather wild, red-headed, bright, blue-eyed, 29-year-old woman who had apparently climbed every tree between Duketown and the next town along that dirt African road. For Mary, life was too routine, too predictable, too comfortable, and too safe. It lacked the challenge she was looking for from pioneer missionary work in the interior. She was restless. She wanted more from missionary life. In fact, only a month after her arrival, she wrote, quote, "One does need a special grace to enable one to sit still. It is so difficult to wait." Her heart was set on doing pioneer interior missionary work. But for that privilege, she would have to wait. After 3 years, as she'd been weakened by attacks of malaria, and it has to be said, many attacks of homesickness, she was allowed a furlough to regain her strength and to reunite with her family. She returned from that furlough refreshed and excited with her new posting, which this time meant going 3 miles into the Calabar interior. Since she had been assigned a portion of her missionary salary to support her mothers and sisters in Scotland, she economized by learning to eat the native food. By this time, she was free to work by herself and have her own lifestyle. And although her very broad Scottish accent was difficult to hide, Mary tried to blend in with the crowd by cutting short her bright red hair, taking off her Victorian clothes. And because she lived in a mud hut and ate local produce, she was able to send most of her money back home to her family. And now her life was no longer routine, and she could organize her own schedule in line with her passion, her giftings and her opportunities. She supervised schools. She gave out medicine. She mediated disputes and mothered unwanted children. On Sundays, she acted as a sort of circuit preacher, going miles into the jungle to share the gospel from village to village, wherever anyone would listen. When 2 deputies were sent out from England to inspect the mission in 1881, they were very impressed. In their report, they wrote, quote, "She enjoys the unreserved friendship and confidence of the local people and has much influence over them." This they attributed partly to the singular ease with which Mary Slessor had picked up and was speaking the local language. It should be noted, however, that evangelism in Calabar was a slow, tedious, and difficult process, not least because the culture embraced witchcraft and spiritism and was very much entrapped and ensnared by it. Cruel tribal customs, such as trial by poison, were deeply rooted in local traditions and seemingly almost impossible to subdue or to change. She encountered, for instance, widespread human sacrifice following the death of a village elder, as it was believed he required servants and retainers to accompany him into the next world. But one of the most tragic and cruel cultural practices was twin murder. This superstition taught that a twin birth was the result of a curse caused by an evil spirit who fathered one of the children. In most cases, both babies were either brutally murdered or left in clay pots to die, and the mother was shunned by the tribe and exiled to an area reserved for outcasts, which most often proved to be a death sentence for her too. Mary not only rescued twins and ministered to their mothers, but also tirelessly fought against those who were perpetuating this pagan ritual, sometimes in the process risking her very own life. She bravely intervened in tribal matters, thus gaining a respect for a woman, something that was previously unheard of in those days. But after 3 years, Mary was once again too ill to remain on the field, and so took her second furlough back in Scotland. But this furlough will be very different and never to be forgotten by many of those who met her. Why? Because she took with her a 6-month-old twin girl called Janie, whom she'd rescued from certain death and had adopted as her own daughter. Janie's twin brother had already died. And although Mary was desperately tired, she was unsurprisingly inundated with requests to speak everywhere. She and Janie were a sensation, and the mission agreed to extend her furlough. This was further extended due to the serious decline in the health of both her sister and her mother, with the result that she was based back in Scotland for 3 years. However, on her return to Africa, she was determined to go even further into the interior. However, not long after returning, news reached her from back home of the death first of her mother, followed 3 months later by the death of her sister, her only surviving sibling, because the other sister had died during her furlough. Mary no longer had no ties back to her homeland. She was distraught and almost overcome with loneliness. She said, "There is no one to whom to write and tell all my stories and my trouble and my nonsense to." But along with the loneliness and the sorrow also came a new sense of freedom and independence. She later wrote, "Heaven is now nearer to me than Britain, and no one will be anxious about me if I go up country." Up country meant Okoyong, a wild, dangerous and untamed area, very or completely unused to seeing white people, and where a number of male missionaries had already been killed. Many declared it total insanity, but Mary was determined to go and could not be persuaded otherwise, believing that to the unreached tribes, her teaching, plus the important fact that she was a woman, would be less threatening than a man. After visiting the area a number of times with other missionaries, she pioneered for the next 25 years in places where no white man had survived. Having learned to speak the native languages fluently, she lived with the Okoyong people for 15 years, teaching them, nursing them, and arbitrating their disputes. In fact, her reputation as a peacemaker spread to outlying districts, and soon she was acting as a judge for the whole region. She developed close personal friendships wherever she went and became known for her pragmatism and humour. She adopted every child she found abandoned and even sent out workers to find twins and protect and care for them at the mission house. Some mission compounds became alive with many babies. As before, she lived a simple lifestyle, insisting on loan stations, which often led her into conflict with the authorities, also gained her a reputation for eccentricity. However, back in the UK, her exploits were being heralded. She became known as the White Queen of Okoyong. She continued her focus on evangelism, settling disputes, encouraging trade, establishing social changes, and introducing Western education. In 1892, she became the first vice-consul to the Okoyong, presiding over native courts, which was a government position she held for years. In that capacity, she acted as a judge and presided over court cases involving disputes over land, debts, family matters, and the like. I mean, her methods were unconventional by British standards because she often refused to act only on the evidence before her if she personally was aware of other factors. But this approach was well suited to African society. And although Mary was highly respected as a judge, and she had influenced the gradual decline in witchcraft and superstition, she saw relatively little progress in bringing Christianity to the Okoyong people. She saw herself as a pioneer, preparing the way for others, with ordained men being her preference. She was not unduly worried that she couldn't send back glowing reports of conversions and churches planted. She did see some fruit from her evangelistic work, but it was mainly in her own family of adopted children. In 1903, near the end of her time at Okoyong, the first baptism service was held, with 7 of the 11 children baptized being her own, and the church was organized with 7 charter members. Her life was a lonely one at times, but during one of her sick leaves to the coast, she met Charles Morrison, who was 18 years younger than her and a young missionary teacher serving at Duketown. They fell in love, and Mary accepted his marriage proposal, provided he would agree to go with her to Okoyong. But the marriage never took place. His health failed and he had to leave. And for Mary, missionary service came before personal relationships. And you have to ask whether she was suited to marriage with her haphazard routine and her living habits. It was said even single women couldn't stand living with her. She was careless about hygiene, with rats, cockroaches and ants in her hut. Meals, school hours and church were all irregular. Fine for an African lifestyle, but not for Europeans. She wore simple, thin cotton garments which would cling to her body in the tropical dampness, which caused one male missionary to insist on walking ahead of her on jungle treks, even though she was supposed to be leading the way. She was careless of health and failed to take the most basic health precautions. Yet she outlived her fellow missionaries, who were much more careful about health and hygiene. For almost 40 years, she suffered recurring attacks of malaria and often endured painful boils on her face and her head, which sometimes resulted in baldness. Her many children kept her young and happy, and she could say, "I am witness to the perfect joy and satisfaction of a single life." Janie, her eldest daughter, whom she had adopted, proved later to be a valuable assistance in the work with her. She pioneered and others followed. Indeed, another woman took over her work at Okoyong. Maybe I'll show you some, and I can say now, no longer pictures, I can say photographs. So here is one of her. I can just about make her out with four. I think they're all Nigerian girls who became part of her family. And here's the incredible Janie. There she is, who became her co-worker for many years. Wonderful. She downplayed the personal costs and never gave up her mission work to return permanently to Scotland. But the fevers eventually weakened Mary Slessor to the point she could no longer walk long distances in the rainforest, but had to be pushed along in a handcart. Early January 1915, while at a remote mission station, she suffered a particularly severe fever and died on the 13th of January 1915, aged 66. Her body was transported down the Cross River to Duketown for the colonial equivalent of a state funeral. A Union Jack covered her coffin. Attendees included the provincial commissioner along with other senior British officials in full uniform. Flags at government buildings were flown at half-mast. Nigeria's Governor-General, Sir Frederick Lugard, telegraphed his, quote, deepest regrets from Lagos and published a warm eulogy in the Government Gazette. One report on her death states, quote, she and her 4 adopted African children were a centre of great attraction and helped to deepen the interest of the whole community in the foreign mission work of the church. It praises her strong and forceful character, her unostentatious manner, and her zeal for the tribes around Calabar. Despite her faults and eccentricities, she was honoured as a great woman of God by her colleagues. Her accolades and legacy include the following. She was the driving force behind the establishment of the Hope Waddell Training Institute. Hope Waddell was the name of a fellow Irish missionary she worked with. This institute provided practical vocational training, and it later numbered the first president of Nigeria amongst its alumni. Slessor was honoured on the back of a banknote by the Clydesdale Bank a few years ago, highlighting her work. And even an asteroid, 4793 Slessor, was named to mark the centenary of her death, which of course was on the 13th of January 2015. In 1950, the anthropologist Charles Partridge, a friend of Slessor in Nigeria, said this: she was a very remarkable woman. I look back on her friendship with reverence, one of the greatest honours that have befallen me. So there we are. A Scottish lass from a dysfunctional Scottish family had the distinction of being the first woman vice-consul in the entire British Empire. And in 1913, a year before the First World War began and 2 years before her death, she was awarded the Honour of St. John, a British Royal Order given by Royal Charter, originally from Queen Victoria. Two quotes to finish from her. In measuring the woman's power, you have evidently forgotten to take into account the woman's God. And blessed is the man or woman who's able to serve cheerfully in the second rank, a big test. There we are. Time has almost gone. What a credible life. What a challenge. Made such a big difference in the world of mission. So happy Easter to all of you. We won't be meeting together next Sunday. You can unmute, and we look forward to seeing you probably in a couple of weeks' time. Great story, John, eh?